Well, hello, photographers. We're back here today to continue to learn some of the basic editing tools and techniques that you'll need to use for this class when we start editing our photos. So, as a very quick review, remember so far we have learned how to use the crop tool, which is this tool here. We've learned how to change our presets. All right. If you don't know how and you haven't figured it out yet, if you have an 8x10 or you have another preset in there and you want to be able to crop more organically, which means not using the standard size, you do have to hit that clear button, okay? And that'll go back to the original ratio. Then you can make it as weird sized as you want. All right. Then we learned how to use adjustment layers to fix our tone. Remember, tone is the amounts of lights and darks. We also use an adjustment layer to fix our color. Today, we are not going to be using adjustment layers. Instead, we are going to be using tools. We're going to be using adjustment tools to do a lot of the things that we just did, but instead of doing it across the entire image, instead, we're going to do it just on select areas. So let's get started. Sorry about that. The first one we're going to do is tone. So just like we've always done, we're going to fix the darks and lights. So let's start first by opening up this image here. So File, Open. You need to navigate to Courses, Art, Yearbook Lesson Files, and you want the file called Color and Tone Tools. And you'll open that. Okay, I already have it open. Once you have it open, let's save this in your network folder. So File, Save As, save on your computer. You need to navigate to your folder. Navigate to your yearbook folder, and you want to put it in your edits folder and just leave it set as color and tone tools and hit save. You can either leave this at medium, or when you are editing I would suggest going to max, but for today you can just leave it on medium because you don't care what you do with these pictures. Alright, so first up it's tone, lights and darks. What these tools do is, again, fixes your tone and color in one specific area rather than the whole thing. And you do it just by using a tool that's similar to a brush. So the first thing we need to do is we need to locate this thing. So if your toolbox is not in the double column format, please change it to double column by clicking on this little double-headed arrow. All I'm doing is single column, now it goes to double, single, double. So I want you to have it set at double so that you can see where the tools are. It'll look just in the same place as mine. And about 3/4 of the way down, there is going to be a drawer. Now, it just depends which tool is showing based on who was using that program last. And there are more tools in here. If you click and hold, so in this drawer, you should have the dodge tool, the burn tool, and the sponge tool. We're going to use all 3 of these today, but we're going to start with the dodge tool, which by default should probably be the one on top. Okay, so just like you see here in this image, the dodge tool lightens areas, and it lightens based on what you tell it to lighten. So with our dodge tool selected, we've got to change some settings up here. All right, so we're going to change, and we're going to fix the tone on just this boot. We're not going to worry about the rest. We're going to do it just this boot because we're going to say that the rest is good even if it's not. But we're going to first start with a brush size, and you always want to use a soft edge brush. Always, always, always. And this is in your general brushes folder. Okay, so general, soft edge. And you want a brush that's a little bit bigger than the area, so we're going to just kind of brush over this boot. So I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Okay, maybe a lot bigger. All right, so I've got mine at like roughly 450 pixels, okay? Then where it's talking about range, it wants to know of your tones, which ones am I lightening? Am I lighting the highlighted areas or your light tones, so like the whites here? Or am I lighting the mid-tones, which are the grays, or am I lightening the shadows? The dodge tool is great is if you have a portrait or another image where a shadow just kind of happens to fall across somewhere you don't want it to, you can literally lighten up that shadow. So we're gonna brighten our highlights because I wanna make these whites kind of pop. And for exposure, that just means how fast it happens. I have never put my exposure more than 20 because it gets crazy fast. I always like to start at 10. 10's usually a pretty good spot. and then you can always go back in time if you need to undo it. But so let's make sure we have our settings, soft blurry brush about 450. We're setting our range to highlights and exposure to 10. All right, and now we're just gonna brush across the boot. And you can brush across once or twice. Notice it's making the highlighted areas a little bit more highlighted. Now, if you want to do it on the other areas, like if maybe I want to make my highlights on this boot a little bit lighter, you can go ahead and do that. So I'm just brushing across, making some of the highlights lighter. All right, so that's that tool. So this is your dodge. So now we're going to switch to your shadows. So remember, shadows again is where your darker tones are. It's going to lift those. I'm going to take my exposure down a little bit because I felt like that last time it was going a little fast. I'm going to go back down to 6%. And I'm going to increase the size of my brush just slightly so I don't have to brush it across so many times. And I'm going to want to darken, or I'm sorry, I want to lighten the dark tones that are here because it's all kind of grayish. I'm just going to click and drag across that boot, and it should lighten where your dark tones are. All right. So now we're going to do the opposite. So if this is your dodge tool, which lightens, the burn tool darkens, but it worked exactly the same way as the dodge tool does. So I'm going to want a soft round brush. I'm going to set my pixels back down to 450 like we did last time. And I want to darken my shadow. So make sure it's set to shadows. Let's take our exposure back down to 6%. And now wherever you see a nice overlap, so like here, I'm going to just, ooh, look at that. See how that pops now? And you can brush over as many times as you want. It'll just make it darker and darker. So I'm in some selected areas where I've got those shadows. I'm just gonna click over. I wanna make my shadows even a little bit darker. Because what I'm doing here is I'm increasing the contrast. I'm not doing it everywhere. I'm just selectively doing it in some areas, but not all. All right, so stop the video and do that now. All right, if I wanted to, if I said in my boot here, there's not as much contrast. I like the lights being that light, and the darks are pretty good, but it's kind of a light color overall. Maybe I want to make the midtones darker, so I'm just going to flip this to midtones, and then I can brush across, and notice it should make that blue a little bit of a darker blue, because that's your midtones that you're darkening. All right, so stop the video and do that now. All right, if you haven't recently, let's just save this. We're gonna go to File, Save. It's gonna save it back to your box, or sorry, back to your folder, just in case the bell rings. That way you don't lose your work, okay? All right, now we're gonna check something, and we're gonna open up a new panel that we haven't checked before we go on. I want you to go to Window, and I want you to open up your Histories panel. Now, some of you may have already been using this. So what your History panel does is it records all of your steps. Okay, it will only go back so far. By default, it's typically 20. I've got mine set at a little bit higher, but usually it will save your last 20 steps. If you need to go further back though, you can always click on the thumbnail at the top. So that's what we're gonna do. We're just gonna click at the thumbnail at the top, just so that we see what it looked like before we started making all these changes. So open up your History panel, and on that little thumbnail of your picture, I just want you to click it. And notice it should go back to what it was originally. So that's before. I'm gonna scroll, but don't worry, it's not lost. I'm gonna scroll all the way back down, and I'm gonna click on my last one. That's where we are. So sometimes I like to do that, like before, after. I can also go back previous steps. So if I'm like, I thought I was good until I got to the burn tool. Maybe I want to redo the burn tool. I can go back to that last step. So notice it gets rid of those. And then if I were to start, it would just clear those out. You don't have to delete the steps. If you go farther back and then you start editing, it'll just delete those that didn't get used. Okay? But we're going to say we loved everything we did. We're going to go back to our last step. Okay? All right, so now we're going to move on. We just got a couple of tools left. The next one that we're going to talk about is the sponge tool. It's the last one in this drawer. So I want you to click and hold. It's going to work just like the last two tools, and by that I mean like a brush. However, your options are going to be different. And what the saturation or the sponge tool does is it deals with the saturation of your colors. That means the intensity of your colors. So think of it in terms of like dull and neon, right? And just like the other ones, you can set the rate at how fast it happens. So we're going to leave it at 5%. And we're going to set it to saturate. So what saturate does is it's going to increase the amount of the purity of that color. So we're going to go back here to the red boot. So we're going to leave it at set on saturate. Make sure you get a nice soft edge brush around 400. And we're going to brush across that boot. And it should start to increase. You may have to do it a few times. I'm brushing across it a few times. If I look back, see how it's making the red just a little bit redder, a little bit brighter. Okay? Now we can do the opposite. We can take some saturation out. So we can say this blue is obnoxious. So we're going to set it to desaturate. And now we're going to brush across that blue boot. And notice it's going to start to gray it down a little bit. It's literally going to suck out some of the blue. So if this is, notice how we're just making it a little less intense, right? So that's your sponge tool. Excellent. We're going to keep continuing on here. Now let's say we've done this. We still don't like that blue boot. There's just the blue is just obnoxious. Well, guess what? We can actually change the color of it. We can do that with a different tool. So we're switching drawers. So far we've covered the dodge, which lightens, the burn, which darkens, and the sponge tool, which deals with their saturation or desaturation of colors. But now we're going to switch to this tool here, and it's in the same tool drawer as the brush tool. It's called the color replacement tool. What this does is it paints, but instead of just painting over a flat color, it sucks out the old color that's there and inserts a new color, but it keeps all the darks and lights, like the shadows and the highlights. It's going to keep all of that, so it's not a flat color. The way you replace it is you need to double click on this foreground color chip here, and it's going to open up this color picker. Okay, now I'm going to make mine just a brown boot. Okay, I'm going to go brown. But if you want to be crazy and you're like, I want to make it a purple boot or a red boot or a green boot, I don't care. But I'm just going to make a brown. So if you want to make brown, go to one of the warm tones. So somewhere down in this range, and you can find a nice brown. What I will say is keep in mind that you may want to pick it a little duller than you want. Most of the time people pick a color that's way too intense, and so it looks obnoxiously bright. All right, so go ahead and set that. And then again, we want a soft edge brush. So up here, if we click, you want to take your hardness down a little bit. We want a little softer. I'm going to say about 75%. And we're going to up the size because we want it about somewhere around 330-ish. Okay, you might have to go a little bit smaller. And now I'm going to come to my boot, and I'm just going to start clicking and dragging. And notice it's going to replace wherever is that blue, it's going to swap it out with the brown and change the color. Now, you got to take your time with this. So you may have to zoom in, and you may have to make your brush a little bit smaller. But it's changing where the crosshair is. In the very center of that's where it's going to switch that color up. So don't worry if you're going off the edge. You can kind of see here. It's only painting where that X crosses over. All right, so go ahead and stop the video and replace the color of the boot. It's okay if you go a little out of the lines. I'm gonna kind of speed along here just so that we can move. Feel free to speed forward until you see me stop coloring the boot. All right, so you're back with me. All right, we're gonna pretend that I did a good job, the best I can, but I still have areas where I accidentally replace the color and I don't want to. But maybe I did it 4 or 5 steps. So the Control Z, or I don't want to go back here because in order to get back here, it might undo something I still did like. It's kind of like not in a clean order, so to speak. Like I just want to remove this step way up here, but I want to keep all of these. Well, the way you do that is you use the history brush tool. So your history brush tool is in the drawer right below the brush, the color replacement brush they were just using. You want to make sure you have the history brush tool, not the art history. It's going to work just the same as all the other tools. So you want a soft brush. I'm going to make it small because I zoomed in. I want to go back in time. That's what this tool does. So if I click and drag across it, it's going to go back in time. It's going to remove whatever I did in that area. Same thing if I kind of went out of the lines here. I'm just going to remove that. It does this with any step. So if I've applied a filter somewhere, if I've changed the darkness or lightness somewhere, whatever that step is, if I brush the history brush across, it goes back previous states, but just in the area that I'm brushing across. It's kind of cool, okay? So with the history brush tool, I want you to stop the video and I want you to just clean up the edges of your boot. All right. Excellent. We are almost done. We're doing really good. So I'm going to review again. So far we went over the dodge, which lightens, burn, darkens, sponge tool, saturates or desaturates the color replacement tool, changes and swaps out one color for another, keeping the lights and darks. And then we just finished up using the history brush tool. Very, very cool. We've also started to learn a little bit more of the history panel. All right, let's save this. So we're going to go to File, Save. And then we're going to continue on with one last tool. And the last tool that we're going to talk about today is the Sharpen tool. So think of sharpening as like crisping things up. So if something's just kind of sort of blurry, it just crisps it up just the littlest bit. I want you to grab the Zoom tool, which is the magnifying glass, and we're going to zoom in on this winged area here. And notice if you zoom in, it starts to get a little blurry. And this tool works if you have subtle blur, but if you have a really blurry image, this is just not going to work, okay? But your Sharpen tool is in this drawer here with the blur, sharpen, and smudge. Now, I'm going to caution you right away. All 3 of these tools require a ton of RAM, which means it can freeze your computer up. That's why we just saved, because this may freeze your computer. Okay, blur and smudge really do it. Sharpen, not quite so much, but if you ever use the blur or the smudge, just know it's going to make a mess, okay? It's going to slow your computer down. But we want the Sharpen tool. It's just a brush, just like the others. Let's take it down to about 170, looks pretty good. For strength, we're not going to go super fast. Let's back it down to, say, 30, okay? And then we're just going to brush across. I'm holding my mouse down and release. Don't do a bunch of little clicks because that's really going to slow your computer down. And you'll know that it applied the changes because if you come back over to your toolbar, you can select other tools. If you come back to your toolbar and it doesn't let you select, that means that it's still working. Okay, you can do it as many times as you want. I'm gonna go crazy sharp. I'm gonna go to 100% because I'm gonna show you what happens when you go too sharp. So if you go at 100%, it's gonna start looking really fake, really fast. See how it's like getting kind of grainy and odd? Okay, that's what happens when you sharpen too much. You're actually gonna get what's called noise or distortion. See that, what's happening? That's because I'm sharpening it too much, all right? I'm gonna zoom back out and I'm going to take my history brush and I'm gonna get rid of that. A little shortcut that I just did there. See how blurry that was? We didn't even notice. Is I'm using my bracket keys on my keyboard to make my brush smaller and bigger. So that's a shortcut for those of you guys who didn't know how to do it. You don't have to go up here to change your size. You can just use your bracket keys. But I'm gonna go back to my sharpen. I'm gonna go down to 63 and I'm just gonna brush across and just crisp up that edge. All right, I'm gonna zoom out here. I'm not going to show you the blur and smudge tools because I don't want you guys to freeze up your computers, but they do the opposite of what your Sharpen filter does. It, instead of crisping things up, it does what it sounds, it blurs, right? But I'm just going to go in my history panel and I'm just going to look and see what it looked like before. So I'm going to go back to, see how it's just a little bit blurrier, and we just sharpened that up. So go back to the last time before you use the sharpening tool and look and see how much crisper that area is. All right. All right, leave it on your last step in your history panel. So we're leaving the sharpening tool on. Let's save this one last time. And now, you guessed it, we are done. So we need to export it. So File, Export, Export As. Export it as a JPEG file. Oops, lost my... Clicking on JPEG. Again, if you were saving this for your own work, I would always bump the quality up to high, but since it's just a tutorial, you can leave it at 6, and you're going to click export. It should take you back to your folder, but if not, travel back to your folder, edits, and just call it color and tone tools and hit save. Yes, we want to replace it because we've already saved it when we first opened it. And there you go. So, one last review. Dodge lightens, burn darkens, sponge is your saturation. Color replacement is how you swap out one color with another. The history brush tool allows you to go back to previous states, but just in a specific area. And then the last thing we did is we sharpened using the sharpening tool. Good job, everybody.